Okay. Oops. So, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the 5th episode in our webinar series, Climate Change, Mobilizing Industry to Make a Difference. My name is Amy Norgard, and I'm a research assistant in the Sustainable Agricultural Landscapes Lab with Dr. Sean Smuckler in the Faculty of Land and Food Systems. So to begin today, I'd like to start by acknowledging that UBC's Vancouver campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And each of you are joining us today from many different places, near and far, and I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional caretaker of those lands as well. I would encourage everyone at some point to take a moment and situate yourselves in your places as well, in asking questions such as, on whose territories do you currently reside, and how have those lands been traditionally managed historically? And if you don't know whose territory you're on, we encourage you to begin that learning. And one great place to start by researching is native-land.ca. So again, thank you for joining us today for the 5th installment of Farm to Globe, Transforming Our Food Systems, a webinar series focused on what has become readily apparent not only to food systems experts, 2 of whom are with us today, but also to the general public. And this is that there is an opportunity for some major benefits through some much needed changes to our food systems. And we'll be exploring the most pressing issues of our food systems we face today and hoping to find some innovative solutions to these challenges. We'll also be focusing on the social inequalities that are present in and exacerbated by all of these issues. And you're here joining us for these discussions that we hope will drive action and discover what steps we need to take to transform our food systems at the farm scale and at the globe scale. So this series is presented by the Center for Sustainable Food Systems at the UBC Farm. It's sponsored by RBC Royal Bank, as well as in partnership with the UBC Faculty of Land and Food Systems and the BC Food Web. The Center for Sustainable Food Systems at the UBC Farm is a teaching and research center, as well as a local to global food hub working towards a more sustainable and food secure future. Their mission is to innovate from field to fork to achieve resilient, thriving, and socially just food systems for all. The BC Food Web is a web portal project which aims to increase access and connection to current research and other research materials. In addition, it aims to encourage innovation between farmers and researchers to enable future project collaborations. And finally, the Faculty of Land and Food Systems is a world leader in research and in teaching about sustainable and healthy food supply. So bringing it back to today's webinar, so our topic is climate change, mobilizing industry to make a difference. And today we have Serena Black and Andy Midwood here to discuss where we're at with our climate mitigation goals, how to encourage industry to join the fight against the climate crisis, and also what needs to be done to move us forward. And before we actually jump in, a bit of housekeeping first. So after each panelist gives a brief presentation, then we'll move on to the Q&A portion of today's webinar. If you have any questions for the panelists, and we hope that you will, please navigate to the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom control, and you can throw your questions right in there. And please feel free to upvote other attendees' questions, and you can do that by using the little thumbs up next to the questions. If you would like the opportunity to chat with other attendees, please feel free to do this in the chat. However, inappropriate or offensive comments won't be tolerated, and will remove attendees if any of that's happening. And so lastly, if there's any tech challenges today, we ask you to bear with us if we have to deal with any of that, but hopefully everything today will be smooth sailing. Sorry, I'm going to move forward. Okay, so I'm going to start off with a brief discussion of my research, and then we'll dive into our panelists that we have today. So just to begin, so as I mentioned, I'm a research assistant in the Sustainable Agricultural Landscapes Lab with Sean Smuckler here at UBC, and my most recent research has actually been on a contract with the Ministry of Agriculture, and it's an opportunity assessment of agriculture greenhouse gas reductions and carbon sinks for the agriculture sector here in BC. So to really contextualize where emissions are coming from in BC, so in 2018, the total emissions from across all sectors in BC was just under 68,000 kilotons of CO2 equivalents, and they're coming from these diversity of sectors. So that's agriculture, land use change and forestry, or LULUCF as we often call it, industrial processes and product use, waste, and energy. And so as you can see, energy is or agriculture, as we traditionally look at it, is a fairly small piece of that pie. However, if we're going to meet climate change mitigation targets, all sectors do need to be contributing to greenhouse gas emission reductions. So agriculture, as it stands in the provincial inventory as it's reported is about 3 to 4% of our emissions, and these are coming from activities such as enteric fermentation, manure management, agricultural soils, burning of crop residues, as well as the use of carbon-containing fertilizers. So that's things like lime and stuff like that. There's other emissions coming from agriculture, and this is attributed to on-farm fuel use. So that's things like stationary combustion, that's heating our greenhouses, as well as on-farm transport. So that's things like driving our tractors. And that's another roughly 1% of BC's total emissions. We also have agricultural emissions coming from land use category, and so that's things like afforestation, deforestation attributable to agriculture, and then also the conversion of grassland to cropland. Some other emissions that aren't actually counted to that total, but also are reported as inventory memo items, are the just management of cropland and grassland, and that's another roughly just under 140 kilotons of CO2 equivalents. And so altogether, between agricultural emissions coming from kind of these different sectors, this way that we do accounting for the provincial inventory, it's roughly about 5% or just over 5% of BC's total emissions. And this is in 2018, just given the delay of how data is published. And so without further ado, I'll pass the floor over to our first speaker, who is Serena Black. And a quick introduction for Serena. Serena is a consulting agrologist with Industrial Forestry Service, and through her work, she works at UNBC's Agriculture Extension, or she's UNBC's Agriculture Extension Specialist, and currently is also the chair of the steering committee of the BC Agriculture Climate Change or Climate Adaptation Research Network, or ACARN, as it's commonly referred to. She's also the general manager for the BC Forage Council and the coordinator of the Cariboo Agricultural Research Alliance. Her climate change research is focused primarily on soil quality, forage, productivity, as well as extension. And with that, I'll pass the floor over to Serena to get us started.
Great, thank you, Amy. I'll just take a second here and make sure that my presentation is sharing. How does that look to everybody?
Great. Yep, that looks great.
Fantastic. Well, thank you everybody for joining us this morning to discuss such a pertinent topic. And I'm very excited to be here. To begin, I do wish to acknowledge that I am joining the webinar today from the unceded territory of the Lheidli at the confluence of the Nechako and Fraser Rivers. And I am pleased to be joining the panel discussion today. And as Amy outlined, we've been asked to discuss the question of how do we encourage or engage the agriculture and agroforestry industries to join the fight against climate change. I admit I'll probably focus a bit more on the agriculture rather than the agroforestry side, although with working at IFS, Industrial Forestry Services, I do get to work a little bit on the forestry side every once in a while. So agriculture and climate change is an inherently complex convergence of challenges and opportunities. And I think it's important to remind ourselves as we think about these challenges, not only in the physical production aspect of how agriculture relates and interfaces with climate change, which I do admit is what occupies most of my work, most of my thoughts, but we also simultaneously must consider the economic, social, and cultural components that are related to these challenges. And as such, I'm going to start my portion of today's webinar by contextualizing, for me, what does fighting climate change mean in relation to BC farmers and ranchers, people who I would argue are already fighting climate change impacts on the ground. This is not something that's happening in the future, but we are fighting these challenges today. And I will discuss then the necessity of collaborative transdisciplinary research that's required, in my opinion, to mobilize industry into action, and the role that I do believe that BCACARN has in filling that need. As I'm sure many people on our call today know, BC's agriculture sector is diverse and complex. Each region throughout the province exhibits substantially different production systems. We're working with intensive systems, including berry, horticulture, dairy operations. We have more extensive operations for cattle, forage, grain crops, as well as some contained systems such as greenhouse production, and a lot of things in between all of those options. We also are dealing with very different climates, soil types, and topography kind of mixed into the equation, and not to mention the varying levels of the available information and data that's required to support on-farm decision-making. So when the question to me is posed, how do we fight climate change in agriculture? How do we get industry on board? My professional and personal experience is to suggest that the fight we are actually facing is to figure out how we can collectively support farmers' ability to increase their resilience to these changing conditions. In order to be resilient, whether we're talking about individuals, an operation, or as an industry, we need to look at both adaptation and mitigation measures that are appropriate to the assets and challenges that are being faced. In short, I'm going to argue that to be resilient, we simply need farmers to be capable to keep on farming. We need more farmers earning Century Farm Awards. We need more entrants into this industry. It will not be business as usual. That's pretty clear. They will need to be adopting new practices in order to build that resilience. That's the only way we're going to continue to have the food security and sovereignty that we need to continue to feed our population during the critical times. At the end of the day, it is about people and how we can make sure that they are able to make an economically viable living in this profession while maintaining mental and physical health and to continue the work to feed our communities. To me, that's the real fight. The remembering that it's about people is not a trivial component to this discussion. Sorry, missed a slide change. It's not going to be business as usual, as I think this image clearly states from a few years back, but is probably reminiscent of many of the perspectives we're seeing in our province today. And luckily, I've had Amy kind of explain some of this point when we're thinking about scoping our discussion today in climate change, that agriculture comparatively is a smaller emitter of greenhouse gases. The sector itself listed at 3.6, but combining the other components of stationary combustion and transport, getting up to that 5.5% range, according to the 2018 provincial greenhouse gas emission inventory. And still, I completely agree. We need to continue working towards searching for opportunities to reduce these emissions, as well as looking for those opportunities of how agriculture could actually be part of the solution, whether it's managing nutrients responsibly, sequestering as much carbon as we can. All of those pieces need to come together. But I do want us to remember that for a comparatively small emitter, farmers are already feeling the impacts and are indeed fighting climate change. This year alone, we're witnessing the impacts of droughts and heat waves. Prince George, amongst many other places in our province, have recorded higher temperatures than we ever have before, with headlines outlining the losses after losses in the agricultural community. We're watching cherries fermenting on the trees, left unharvested, apples sunburning in those extreme heats. We're seeing livestock suffering from the heat, not just cattle, poultry. We're seeing issues with our fish health. Forage production deficits will be forcing ranchers to make some tough decisions moving into our winter months. And this heat has led to the glaciers melting faster, which has some regions looking at facing raging wildfires and smoke, and has actually led to substantial flooding in other regions. So we are actually seeing flooding and fires simultaneously on our landscape this year. So in short, my thesis statement to kind of frame our discussion today would be that we all need to eat to live, and we all depend on farmers and ranchers to keep growing these crops and raising these livestock in order for us to do so. Which leads us to what can be done to support adaptation and the mitigation efforts within the agriculture and agroforestry sectors. To help industry have the capacity to support the transition to adaptive practices, in my short time today, I'm going to argue that we really need more data and we need more applied research. We require this information in order to support the farmer's ability to make those on-farm decisions, for cities to develop sustainable community plans, and for our provincial leaders to make informed policies and mandates. Just to provide some context to what I'm referring to, I'm going to use a couple of examples of the challenges that producers have really outlined where we need more data and more research. In no way is this a comprehensive list or has been analyzed and coordinated in order of priority, but really just something to sink our teeth into our discussion today. So when we're thinking about data gaps in our province, one of the first things that often comes almost immediately to mind, perhaps more where I am up north and in other parts of the province, is weather, agriculture weather. A lot of adapting farm practices to mitigate and adapt to climate change is about changing the time you seed a crop, the time you're harvesting, when you should be applying nutrients and pesticides, utilizing frost protection measures, all of those components, and all of that relies on having good, reliable weather data. The availability of this data varies substantially throughout the province, and there are a lot of additional challenges in maintaining the systems that we do have. Water, something I'm almost scared to bring up during meetings with a lot of producers. It's a sensitive topic in agriculture and is impacting producers throughout the entire province. With the new Water Sustainability Act, we can all agree that this is a extremely valuable resource that we need to be protecting and managing appropriately. But we still have a lot of unmapped watersheds, not a lot of information, and it's not always clear the idea of the full volumes and availability of that water. And so there's some baseline data that we're missing there, and the availability of that information, again, is extremely important to the decisions being made on farm. This information varies between the different regions and is absolutely critical when we're talking about how do we encourage producers to increase their water use efficiencies and all of those types of decisions that they have to make on a regular basis. And finally, soil. It's all about soil when you think about it, as we do have baseline soil data for our province. And although there are a few gaps in rural areas, I always like to ring that bell. I still can't find some baseline soil data for a couple of the regions I work in, but still there's an additional requirement that we need this data to analyze the trends of the soil quality in our province. We need to develop an agreed upon methodology in order to collect the soil data and develop a comprehensive data set that would allow comparison to historical records that we do have, so that we can analyze the impact of management, all of which is critical to assessing what are the best management practices under these different conditions. How can we provide that information to producers in a way that's meaningful for them and that they know that they're trending in the right direction? There's also new data that needs to be collected and analyzed. So a lot of discussion around soil carbon, but there's also a lot of information around soil biological processes under different systems, and learning more about those systems is required. And so these are complex challenges, and complex challenges do require complex solutions and a diverse skill set and knowledge base. And to me, that's where I see ACARN stepping in. So BCACARN was established as part of this solution in that we needed a provincial network that fosters collaboration between academic, government, and industry researchers to improve the adaptation, research, and extension that we can provide. So ACARN aims to share research-based information, expertise, and resources across BC and develop a network of projects to be able to advance in this much needed work. ACARN coordinates several different regional and provincial events to connect people with the project and resources that are focused on adaptation and mitigation strategies across all the different agricultural commodities. By sharing knowledge and connecting these diverse perspectives, we aim to develop creative solutions. This includes breaking down the silos and developing the opportunities to collaborate between industry and partner and producers directly. The world we live in is very fast-paced, with a lot of initiatives and projects happening, things changing fairly quickly, and with the time and resource pressures that are often faced by researchers, the challenge really is, how do we connect with each other? And that's where I believe ACARN is stepping in. We are developing a network that provides these opportunities to share results and projects, which will reduce redundancy on the work that's being done, allow us to learn from each other and about different things that have from different parts of the province and how that might apply elsewhere, and really begin the process of working together. These collaborations also means that we can support researchers in different fields to connect with each other through natural sciences, economics, policy analysis, sociocultural barriers, all of which I think if we're able to work together will actually increase the odds of these projects actually finding the applicable solutions. We can't be working independently, but really require that transdisciplinary approach. And BC ACARN members are continuously looking to develop these network projects that can start to address the data gaps that exist and develop innovative tools and approaches to these real-time challenges that we are facing. So going back to those three examples of data needs that I've outlined, I'm going to just touch base really briefly on some of the initiatives that the BC ACARN members have coordinated to address these challenges. So when we're thinking about weather, ACARN does have a climate and weather data working group, which has worked diligently in identifying the gaps in agricultural weather data availability, advancing options for better data and decision aid support tools for producers. Recently, the group was able to coordinate a report outlining a roadmap for sustainable agricultural weather network in BC. The report, which was prepared by agricultural meteorologist Andrew Nadler, included the status of the meteorological monitoring within BC, an assessment of the baseline coverage in agricultural areas, the guidance for operational structure that builds on existing assets, and some tangible action items for improving weather monitoring and tools for agriculture in BC. The report itself is available on our website if anybody's interested, as well as a recording of the webinar that goes through the results in detail. And the working group is now moving forward and figuring out what those next steps are. When we talked about water, we do have a research team led by Dr. John Janmat at UBC Okanagan, which is working on a research project focused on the regulatory environment in BC and how it's affecting agricultural resilience to changes in water supply resulting from climate change. The project has 2 case study regions, so really going through what this looks like in the Okanagan and the Cariboo as a starting point, and is currently in the final stages of the project. And while it is outlining the challenges that are currently being faced, the project also aims to highlight the opportunities and potential solutions and growth for that sector as well. So it's important to keep an eye out for that. More information on the final results will be forthcoming in the next few months. And another example that recently the members of ACARN have been working on is to develop a proposal for projects that would support mapping soil carbon across both the agricultural and forestry landscapes in our province, in order that we can start to evaluate the impact of land use change, potentially identify our land's potential for some carbon sequestration, all of those really key components I've already touched base on. And while this work is in development and we're still kind of searching towards funding opportunities in order to get going, I can say from personal experience, it's already led to some engaging researchers from multiple universities, looking at different levels of government researchers, as well as staff from multiple different provincial ministries. And therefore, I think we're already seeing that collaboration and for a potential to lead to meaningful change and have a positive impact for the agriculture sector. So in the brief time that I've had, I've really focused on the data gaps here, but it does relate directly to the need for continued support for adaptation and mitigation research. BC is lucky that we do have some innovative forward-thinking programming, including the Farm Adaptation Innovator Program that is focused on trialing new practices, engaging with producers, and looking for opportunities for those climate solutions. It's along with resources to increase data, we need to continue to prioritize these type of programs that are responding directly to producer identified challenges and working directly with industry. It is critical for us to be increasing the adoption of resilient practices, and we're fortunate that BC has been able to take some of these meaningful steps forward in this direction, large part thanks to the work being done by the Climate and Agriculture Initiative of BC, but there are additional programs also working towards these goals. So in conclusion, I believe that there is a significant component to mobilizing industry and supporting that transition to a more resilient agriculture system, focused specifically on continuing to find ways to collaborate with as many people and perspectives as possible to make those changes happening on the ground. Meaningful research relies on building meaningful relationships with engaging with farmers, ranchers, industry, our Indigenous communities, all levels of government. We need this data and we need this associated and related research in order to ensure that the producers have the baseline data and support they require to build resilience into their decision-making, and that we have this research that reduces the need for producers to take on any additional production risk and associated additional costs to those risks. We need to remember to recognize the areas where we are making progress and focus on the climate solutions that do exist in the sector. And this can only be done if we continue to work side by side with with the farmers and industry directing this work. And with that, thank you.
Great, thank you, Serena. That was a bunch in a short period of time, and clearly definitely listened to you for much longer. So thanks for jam packing so much into to such a quick presentation. Um, and so we will switch gears now to our second panelist. Oops, I'm just gonna move that. Okay, so next up, following Serena, we have Andy Midwoods. So Andy is the senior soil scientist at Terramera, and he has a research background. So prior to joining Terramera, he worked at UBC in Kelowna, and before that, the James Hutton Research Institute in Scotland. The central theme to Andy's work has been building an understanding of soil carbon, what it controls its accumulation, and also how to prevent its losses. He was recently involved in a study to examine the influence of irrigation on soil carbon in the Okanagan Valley. And over his career, Andy has worked in a range of different systems, from the managed to the natural lands. At Terramera, he is focused on developing new, low-cost means to measure soil organic carbon at a field scale, with the hopes to unlock carbon markets for the farming community. And so with that, I will pass the floor over to Andy to get us started.
Great, thanks, Amy. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks for the invitation to speak today. It's great. So I'm just going to do the nerve-wracking bit now and get my screen sharing. So hopefully you can all see that okay. Actually, I need to go back a slide. That's all. There we go. Great. Okay, hopefully that's you can see that. Okay, great. So thanks, Serena, for you kind of laid the landscape there of many of the challenges that the agriculture sector faces in terms of climate change. And I was delighted that you mentioned soil data as one of those gaps, because that's really what I wanted to talk about and sort of focus on today. So I work for an agri-tech company called Terramera. And I thought what I'd do in my talk would be just to explain a little bit about Terramera and where they've come from, what they've done, and how they're now focusing some of their activities on soil carbon and soil health, and go into that a little bit further and what that means for our fight against climate change. So Terramera is an agri-tech company, a relatively new company. We're founded in 2010, about 120 employees, and we're based in Vancouver, but quite a few of the team work remotely around Canada. We have about 250 patents. It's a very innovative company, always developing new and new technologies, new ways of doing things. And up until probably a few years ago, much of their work was focused on the agrochemical industry, really, and they have been using a suite of compounds which they group together and call Actigate technology. And Actigate technology is really just a way of improving the efficiency of existing agrochemicals. So and they improve the uptake and absorption of these chemicals. And so that means you can use less of them, so it's good for costs, and it's also better for the environment, obviously. So this is work that they've been doing for many years, and this has kind of been a good revenue stream for the company. And so, you can see schematically here, this is kind of what it looks like without this Actigate additives to chemicals, to the agrochemicals, like herbicides and insecticides, things like that. You need to use a lot more, and then with the Actigate technology, you can use much less. So it's all good stuff. But in developing this kind of cutting edge chemistry, they've used a lot of computational science, computational chemistry approaches, and started really using lots of modeling, lots of AI kind of approaches. Now, a lot of that is obviously focused on plant health and looking at the effects of these chemicals on plant health. And to do that, they've, for example, built machine learning sort of visualization products to look at things like aphids, for example, counting them on leaves, using some really clever computing kind of together with technology and instrumentation. And other examples might be, for example, analyzing fruit on grapes, for example, here, and looking at sugar content, again using a combination of in the field technology, but also some clever sensing and data processing and kind of data intelligence kind of approach. And that has led, to a whole range of different products. And one of the things we've now got is, for example, these what we call Internet of Things or IoT sensors, which we can now deploy in the field, and they can pick up, different climatic conditions in the field and soil moisture. And these are, very cheap, readily deployable. And so they help farmers really make decisions about how to manage their crops and improve crop plant health and crop productivity and yield. So kind of with that background, and obviously all that kind of technology and understanding that they've built up over that relatively short period they've been in business, they, a kind of fundamental understanding of all of this is, it's kind of natural that it turns to soil and the way soil kind of underpins agriculture and is such a crucial component in our fight against climate change. And in particular, we're talking really about soil organic carbon and carbon content of soil, which is, is the big thing that we think about in terms of how do we draw CO2 out of the atmosphere, that harmful CO2 out of the atmosphere, and sequester it in our soils. And then so that's led to a whole range of new work now in Terramara, which is really getting off the ground now, and which is why I've been employed by the company and kind of, obviously involved in a lot of that work. And it's kind of driven by this whole idea of climate smart agriculture, in particular this concept of regenerative agriculture, which is really, it's fully recognized, I think, that in the past agriculture has, had taken a toll of the soil carbon content. It reduced it, quite significantly in some regions across Canada, and that was recognized quite a long time ago, and people are now trying to, adopt practices which help rebuild that carbon. So things like no-till, for example, is a classic one, which has really helped and is starting to build up those carbon levels and building them back up really to where they were before the agriculture kind of came along and started, first broke into that soil. The idea of regenerative agriculture, I think, and what sets it apart from a kind of more sustainable view of it is that you can try and go beyond that. So you try and not only get the carbon levels, if we just focus on carbon, which is really what I would like to, take your attention today, is to build those soil carbon content, up and beyond where it was, and really try to accumulate soil carbon in the, in the soil. And that's, there are so many great things that then, everything then comes from that. Nutrient cycling improves, the whole soil carbon health improves, water infiltration, and lots of things. Serena was just talking about, they are basically all stems from having healthy soil, even down to, the health of the mental health of farmers, I would argue. And so very much focused on that, healthy soils, good biodiversity, high carbon levels, sequestering CO2 out from the atmosphere is, it's good for the planet, but it also is good for predictability of yields and yield quality, and ultimately down to, the profitability of farming. And that's, obviously key to making the whole thing work. So that's why there's a real, lots of really great reasons why we want to do that. And why there's such a focus on soil carbon. But the other thing, obviously, I almost don't need to mention is that in building soil carbon up, we also are reducing and drawing down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Plants have developed over millions of years, and they are very good at capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So it's what they do best, and so we can deploy that to help then mitigate the effects of climate change, which I think, anyone who lives in BC is very much aware of, with all the forest fires and things that we've been facing, but other things such as soil erosion all leads into these other more global factors. So, but one of the things I think is a challenge. It's okay, yeah, we need to build soil carbon, but if you're a farmer, you can do that, but it's great if you can be incentivized to do that, and you can actually benefit, from that in terms of income stream and revenue, and that's kind of the aspect of it that Terramar is trying to enable and promote, and that's kind of where the business model, I guess, comes from, and that really stems from the fact that, and I think Serena mentioned this, that when we think about soil carbon and measuring that in the field, it's actually quite a difficult thing to do at a very large scale, and do that with any level of confidence. And typically when we measure soil carbon in the field, in the past has meant going out, taking soil cores, and then analyzing them back in the lab. And so that soils are naturally heterogeneous. They change the topography of the land and things like that, and the land history and drainage. There's a whole raft of things affect that. So if you want to really build up an understanding of a soil and the soil carbon stock at any level, that's incredibly difficult to do, and it's very expensive. And because of that, this is kind of acting as a barrier really to this whole idea of carbon trading. So this is the concept that if farmers can accumulate carbon in their soil, and we can measure that, then that can then lead to carbon credits, which can then be bought and traded in a sort of carbon trading market, and that then feeds direct revenue back to the farmer for you can have good practices in sequestering carbon in their soils. So why shouldn't they benefit from that? And that enables the whole sort of cycle, if you like. But part of the issue is, how do we measure soil carbon? How do we get an agreement on how that carbon is measured, and the uncertainties around it, and all of that. So that is really has really kind of stifled this whole carbon credit market in the agricultural sector. But there is real pressure now building. There is more and more companies now trying to look for ways to tackle that and deal with it. And that is part of the real focus of work that we're doing. And that is all about how can we really use advanced measurement and modeling techniques to reduce the cost of carbon measurement in the field. And that's drawing on all that past experience that the company's built up in terms of monitoring plant health and using imagery and their advanced, machine learning models, all that kind of thing. So we're kind of bringing all of that technology to bear and focus on this question of soil carbon, and can we really start to map and model and quantify soil carbon now cost effectively, but at scale, to a point that we can then use that to sort of unlock this soil carbon trading scheme for farmers and really enable them to benefit from the carbon they supply to them. So that's kind of one of the core missions of the company at the moment, is to try and address those issues. And it's important because, as mentioned in the introduction there, for example, in the Okanagan Valley, in a project I was involved with before working for Terramar, we looked at soils under irrigated agriculture. So this was under woody perennial crops, such as apples, grapes, and cherries. And the irrigation and that whole cultivation process then, that system, has actually really had a marked effect on soil carbon content, and it's doubled the soil concentration in the top 0.30 centimeters, and changed the overall carbon stock content from 22 to 38 megagrams of carbon per hectare. So really dramatic increases in soil carbon. And so that's great news, but we want to keep doing that. We want to keep increasing soil carbon contents if we can. And why shouldn't farmers benefit from that, from that practice? And that enables them to, keep adopting some practices to keep promoting soil carbon sequestration. So that's a key thing. And if we look kind of more widely in a sort of more general term, right across Canada, for example, this is some data taken from AFC. You can see that, particularly across the prairie regions here, we've seen some really dramatic increases in soil carbon levels. This is, I think, data from 1980s through to 2011. But over that time, you can see that carbon content in these soils has increased. So, and that's mainly down to the adoption of no-till, but also reduction of summertime fallow periods. So anytime there's no plant on the soil, that soil's starting to lose carbon. And so, we want to keep plants as much as we can growing on soils, because they're always feeding the soil, feeding biodiversity and pushing carbon into the soil. So it just shows, there is potential, but I think there is potential to go even further than this and really, start to grow that carbon content. But if we can do that and monetize it for the farmers, then that will ultimately really help, drive that in the right direction and address climate change. And so this is kind of a quick schematic of how that would work. So basically, farmers, if we can show and accurately measure a carbon change, which is, the big stumbling block at the moment, then we can issue carbon credits for that carbon that's been sequestered, which, industry is clamoring to buy these kind of things now because they want to offset their carbon emissions. They want to show that they're carbon neutral. And then in doing that, there's a revenue produced, which can then go back to the farmer and, help them keep going in that direction, which I think is really good. So it's a real way of just, enabling the farm to keep doing the right thing and also help tackle climate change. So that's kind of the work we're doing. And we're in the early stages of it at the moment, and we're, developing some of this technology. So, I think that was my last slide. So thanks very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Andy. Another great presentation. So we will switch gears now, and we will move into our Q&A portion of the webinar. So I will remind everyone to submit your questions as we're transitioning here. So we do have some kind of curated questions that we have to ask Serena and Andy, but we also would love to obviously answer attendee questions live today. So again, a reminder to navigate to that Q&A section of the Zoom panel and submit your questions. And you can also look at the questions that have already been submitted, and you can upvote the questions that seem most interesting to you, so we know where to start and where to go. So it looks like we do have one question to start here. So first question, what's the biggest agricultural practice within the agricultural industry that you think needs to stop or be altered in order to make a difference for climate change? And I think I'd like to pass this question to Serena, and then also Andy, of course, feel free to answer this as well if you'd like. But I'd love to hear from Serena, given that your presentation was really contextualized and really extension focused and working with farmers.
Yeah, difficult question to start with, primarily because I find a lot of the time when we have these discussions, they can be quite polarizing, and that I'd be very hesitant to say any one practice is the cause of or contributing the most to climate change. We all love no-till, but there's actually, from my personal experience, which is very focused on forage and extensive systems, where tillage might actually be the best way to rejuvenate a field that then goes into production and doesn't get tilled for 30 or 40 years. So there's no one right practice or wrong practice. And I also have to realize that, and within my scope of practice and my own experience, that I do research very specific commodities where there might be opportunities in other commodities that I'm a little less aware of. But I think really what needs to be happening is having those conversations directly with producers who might be doing practices that are leaning towards a decline in soil quality, a decline in soil carbon, and finding out what are the pressures and reasons towards them choosing those management practices, and then finding out a solution. I've yet to find a farmer who wants to apply more inputs than necessary. I've yet to find a farmer who doesn't want to have soil that can manage nutrients and manage water. But I think it's mostly figuring out where those pressures exist that are pushing them towards using those management practices, and how can we support them in that transition? How can we support farmers who perhaps are tilling more than they need to be? How do we help them transition to more of a no-till system, or developing those riparian buffers or different shelter belts that they'll help protect their lands? So which is potentially a non-answer. Maybe Andy has some more specific ideas, but I don't like the rhetoric of pointing fingers. I don't think it's helpful, and it's not going to encourage anyone to adopt different practices.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Serena. It's very hard just to say one particular thing. I mean, I think the only thing I think I would say that the no-till obviously is because that is applied across such vast acreages and prairies in particular, then that does have quite a big effect. And so, if I had to stick my head over the parapet, I would say it's no-till. But as Serena said, there are instances where till is good, and there is research about no-till which suggests that some of the carbon sequestration may not be as great as we think. It's more a redistribution of carbon in soil profile. So you've got to be careful how you interpret the data, and that's one of the big challenges, I think.
Awesome, thank you. And I really appreciate the perspective of avoiding something that really polarizes the industry and almost is like taking a step back instead of us all working to kind of move forward. And Serena, your perspective of the thoughts on what are the pressures that are pushing farmers to make these decisions, because it really is that farmers are making the best decisions with the tools that they have, and both of you did a great job of outlining kind of these gaps in research and data and like these support tools that are really necessary for moving our industry forward. And to add to that, I do want to contextualize both of your answers that this is quite BC specific, and the difficulty in answering that in that we have such a diverse agriculture industry here. Your answers would maybe be different, also maybe similar if we were looking at the prairies, but here we have like the orchard industry, we have enteric fermentation emissions coming from like our beef and our dairy sectors, and both of you have largely touched on, of course, the extent of just like croplands, especially in forages. So yeah, those were great answers, but again, those are definitely quite specific to BC, which is perfect for today's webinar. Thank you. So we'll move on to a second question. Maybe this will be a bit easier for both of you and contextualizing more to soils. So second question, considering all of these different soil types and ecosystems across like our diverse province, should we be taking a more local approach to the fight against climate change instead of kind of these province-wide policies that we oftentimes see? And I guess maybe we'll go in the reverse this time. Andy, can we start with you on this one?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it is interesting. I mean, there is, in the work that we're doing now is, how do we deal with all of those different soil types, and how, because they all respond differently, and they have, there's a sort of myriad of factors to consider that. So I do think, yeah, there is real merit in taking a much more kind of localized approach, I suppose, in doing that. Yeah, for sure. I would agree.
Great. And Serena, do you have anything to add to this question?
Well, yeah, I think it's pertinent. I definitely working along Highway 16. I've been in many single fields with 3 different soil types in a single field. So yeah. it is like, so how do you provide supports when you have that much variability and heterogeneity in the fields? And I do think that's really the link where I'm seeing ACARN kind of playing. So in BC, we have had some great programs that are focused on regional adaptation requirements, but then are able to bring it provincially to intersect. So when there are going to be new challenges up north, say like pest management. So new and emerging pests challenges that we've never had to experience before. There's going to be a lot of data and information we can learn from from the lower mainland, from the Okanagan. So being able to start locally and really identifying those challenges and those and the contextual issues, and then linking provincially and nationally and beyond. But I see that's kind of where ACARN plays a role, as well as the other. There's a lot of different initiatives in our province kind of taking it from regional to provincial, but I do see that as the way forward, perhaps biasedly, but yeah, absolutely.
No, I would agree with that as well. So as Andy's saying, like our soils behave differently. As you're saying, like you can have 3 different soil types in one field managed by one farmer. And then also from my past work, we're assessing BMPs in terms of kind of trying to prioritize BMPs for kind of widespread implementation. And it is really hard when you're trying to do this accounting and add data to a BMP, or sorry, a beneficial management practice, such as like the implementation of the examples you guys have been using, like no-till, or even just using cover crops. How those perform really does depend on these soil variables, these ecosystem variables. So I would definitely really support the answers you guys are giving. Great, thank you. I'm going to move on to a third question. Do you know if there's research like this happening that also includes urban farming? Serena, let's start with you. Do you know if your research, or are you working with colleagues that are looking at urban farming contexts?
Absolutely. I think I can think of a couple of different initiatives throughout the province that really are supporting urban agriculture. Particularly, I just feel I'm biased based on my personal experience. So I'm definitely probably missing a few. I know there's a lot of work that Farm Folk, City Folk does specifically. I'm also aware the Kamloops Food Policy Council has a couple of urban farms and are really making some excellent strides of how to utilize their space, their urban space to grow food. I think I'm probably just a little less familiar with the extent of that work that's going on, but I do know that there are pockets of that work and researchers, both I could think of at the University of Northern BC, TRU, but throughout our network that probably are encompassing some of the urban farming components.
Great, thank you. And Andy, is any of your work being applied to urban contexts, or are you largely working with more
like it's not really, to be honest, so I don't really have much to add to this.
No, that's great. Thank you. I mean, I would also echo what both of you have said, although maybe we'll see that change. I think that with the pandemic, I think that everybody started a garden in the last year, and people are maybe
that's all good.
Yes, maybe pivoting from that into becoming maybe urban farmers. So maybe we'll see a change in that. But I would echo that as well, that my work is largely focused on more larger scale producers. Great. The next question, while agriculture is a significant contributor to climate change, it also seems like our industry, more so than others, is especially committed to finding solutions. What's been the most inspiring change or innovation within agriculture you've seen? And I would personally tack onto that question. I'm curious if through your work and working with farmers, if that feels like it's motivated by the fact that really our agriculture industry is going to feel the effects of this, maybe more so than other industries. And so I'm curious if that's feeding into the motivation that's kind of behind that's happening. Andy, did you want to tackle that one first?
Yeah, definitely. I can talk about that. So I was looking to have a conversation with Gabe Brown last week, and Gabe Brown is a regenerative farmer in the States. He's if you don't know him, I would suggest you look up some of his YouTube videos. He's really inspirational, and he's a regular farmer at one time, and he went through a series of crop losses through hailstones and drought, which meant he got no profit, nothing off his farm for I think 4 years in a row, and he decided after that he needed to do something. So he changed his whole system, and now he farms completely regeneratively, and it's really amazing, and it's a really inspiring kind of story to listen to. And Gabe is he's a believable character. He's just a farmer, but when you listen to him, it's really amazing to hear his story and the transformation he's made of his farm. Because regenerative agriculture, a lot of people think, oh well, you can't apply that to a big kind of mainstream farm. He's shown you can, and you can really improve your soils through these processes. But also, importantly, his yields are as good as anyone's, if not better. And so he's still making money, and it's a sort of sustainable financial model as well. So really inspiring. And I think, I would encourage anyone who's not seen any of Gabe Brown's videos to check him out. It's really great.
Awesome, thank you. I will definitely be checking out that farmer. I don't know if I've heard that name before.
Yeah.
That's an exciting new opportunity for me to
learn. It's quite simple.
Cool. And Serena, how about yourself? What are you seeing kind of on the front lines working with farmers?
Yeah, I think and I've been lucky enough to see Gabe Brown in person at a couple of conferences, and what I'm excited about is we're actually starting to see a few Canadian farmers also building their reputation for being truly regenerative agriculture. And I really am just honestly inspired mostly by the one-on-one farm partners who volunteered to do research with me. It's a community that makes their living off of taking care of the land. Their entire livelihood and their depends on it, as well as the next generations. And they're always talking about the next generations. And I think we're seeing this surge of new entrants. The work that the young agrarians are doing, the people who are coming to agriculture want to be diversified. They want to be a part of the solution, and that energy is quite contagious. And it's hard to point at like one inspiring change. I'm in love with forages, and I might be one of the few, but working with the Canadian Forage and Grassland Association nationally, seeing what the other provincial forage associations are doing, there's some great work being done throughout the entire country. Manitoba in particular has a regenerative agriculture conference, the Manitoba Forage and Grassland Association. And it's usually attending those and hearing from those farmers about what's motivating them, how they've adapted. A lot of them started with Gabe Brown, and now we're hearing about how they've adapted that system to a Canadian context, to maybe like a Northern Alberta context, which is a little bit different of growing conditions than Gabe. But for me, like a quick example is I'm working with this farm partner who has been managing that land for over 100 years, that family has, and working on this pasture rejuvenation project where they just got to, like, in a systematic way, trial different no-till equipment and figure out this actually might be an opportunity where I could reseed into existing pasture without tilling and without any herbicide, but the conditions have to look exactly like this for it to be successful. And for them to be able to like spot areas on their farm, and it might not be the full 300 acres, but maybe just that 5-acre patch that they could rebuild without having to go through the additional cost associated with either tillage or spraying, and figuring out that will be worth the time and the seed, where in those conditions it might not work. I think it's watching them have the questions, set up their research, and then like carry it through over 3 years and picking out those golden nuggets of how they're going to adapt to those practices moving forward. I think that's, for me, what is inspiring is their commitment to trying something over and over again and figuring out in what context is it going to work.
Awesome, thank you. It sounds like both of you have had amazing opportunities to work with some very inspiring farmers. I can hear it in your voices when you talk.
Yeah, I'm always amazed, actually. I just want to come back with that. Because we reach out to farmers all the time looking for trial sites and things like that. And, they're always really enthusiastic. They always want to engage. And I when I joined a commercial company, I was a little concerned whether that dynamic would change, because I've always come from academia and so kind of less suspicious, but it's not, farmers in general, I found, are just, they really care about their soil. They want to do things right. And they're really interested to talk about it and discuss and look for new ways of doing things. It's great. Yeah, that's a really nice part of the job I do.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and thanks for adding that last piece about coming from academia and joining a private company. I feel the same, having obviously at the beginning of my career, or so far in my career, just being associated with UBC and kind of almost having a bit of that in where I'm not associated with a private company, and there is that inherent trust. And it's awesome to hear that you've still been having those experiences with farmers, because I would say the same. I'm constantly impressed by the time and the knowledge that farmers share with me, and the on-farm trials that they're doing to further this, as like Serena's pointed out, to basically like jump over some of those data gaps just for themselves, and then also sharing with their farmer, like their counterparts as well, so generously. Like, they're not just keeping that knowledge for themselves in their own system. So yeah, I'd share the same. It's very inspiring how they're really committed to land management. Okay, so moving on, this question, let's see, what question are we on? This is a great question, and it really ties into, the topic for today. So question 5, how do we incentivize large industrial agriculture who are maybe growing monoculture fields to shift to a more regenerative model? And we've already touched on this a bit in some of the other questions, but more like straightforward in this question. And is that model even possible? So the regenerative model, is that even possible on an industrial scale? Andy, did you want to start by tackling?
Well, yeah, I feel like maybe we've already answered this in a way, but I think that with just the experience of Gabe Brown and the work that he's done really has shown that it is possible, and there is ways of changing it and still making your farm profitable. And that's the key thing, because ultimately farms have to make a living. And actually, in moving to a more regenerative model, what you do is you build resilience into your system, and that's a really crucial thing. You reduce the need for fertilizers and pests and agrochemicals to a certain extent. So, I think it is possible, and I think the only way you can do that really is to see kind of the work that, to see examples where it succeeded, and then, and take from that. Because as Serena says, it's not a one size fits all. It has to be adapted to the particular farm and the system that you have. But I firmly believe it can do that. There is a way to do that and take it forward. And I think it's the best way, really. And I think in terms of building soil carbon, that's got to be a key way to do that. You can't just keep doing what you've been doing in the past.
Great, thank you. And Serena, would you be able to add to that from your experiences as well?
Yeah, I think I will simply echo what Andy said. It's absolutely possible at an industrial scale. We are seeing it on the large part. What I find exciting about the concept of regenerative agriculture, and I do also recognize that that term might actually mean different things to different people, but what I find really inspiring about it is that there is this acknowledgement about the importance of diversity and livestock incorporation into the operations, one or the other. I think what we need to do is make sure, absolutely, as Andy said, we need to demonstrate this. So I think that's some of the exciting work that we might be able to look forward to is some climate solutions, some living labs in BC that can start demonstrating what these principles look like. Amy, you mentioned earlier cover crops. That can be a substantial component to introducing the start of a regenerative principle into larger industrial scales. But which cover crop do you choose, and which is going to be best suited to what you're using? So finding opportunities to really provide some of those demonstrations, those on-farm research components of how do we transition. I think the one thing that I've noticed a lot is that you can be sitting in a room of people who really want to change, producers who are really looking for those practices to adopt, and they see Gabe Brown, they're like, that's awesome, but I have no idea where to start. So I think really what our role is how do we support that transition? And it's not going to go from these large industrial monocrops to beautiful food forests overnight. That we're talking 5, 10, 20 years, 50 years is what we really should be thinking about. So really, when we're having these conversations with these producers, is what is one component of regenerative agriculture that you could incorporate now? And once that's incorporated, what's the next component? And really work with them on a step-by-step basis so that to help them ease through that transition, still be economically viable, not feel stressed out. And as Andy said, build their resilience. That's where it comes to, is by doing incorporating these practices, they are building their resilience.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, you've touched on so many good pieces there of that if we put farmers out of business by trying to have them change their systems, then we really don't have any food to eat. So it does need to be economically sustainable in the long run. And that point of this farmer to farmer knowledge transfer, as much as Andy and I and Serena have all talked about that we have amazing relationships with farmers and they're so generous in their knowledge, it's so much more meaningful for a farmer to explain and demonstrate that a system works than it is for any of us as extension agrologists to just say information without really having any context for that. So I think that's a good piece as well. And Serena, mentioning the regenerative piece, to touch on that, our current, or the current mandate, I'm not sure, I guess, what it's specifically called, but with the Ministry of Agriculture, regenerative agriculture is written into our mandate. As you're saying, I think we're still actually in the flux of figuring out exactly what that means, that we have a concrete definition for us to all use. Andy did use it in his presentation, which I really appreciated. And I really do find it that in this avoidance of polarizing an industry so that we can keep moving forward. And as Serena's saying, maybe it's baby steps for the next 20 years, but as long as we're moving forward, regenerative is kind of a nice way to not end up in that conventional versus organic polarization, because all of our farms can be adopting regenerative practices. So I kind of like it. Like we do need to solidify that definition a bit more, but I like that we've kind of maybe come in this like middle ground that we can all move forward with. Anyways, I will continue with our questions. Let me see. I'm not sure how much time we have left for questions, but so question 6, are there any citizen science projects going on to fill in these data gaps? So Serena, this kind of maybe seems like a question for you. I'm thinking specifically for soil data. You could get farmers and citizens to collect soil samples, send them in. Is that something that's going on, or is there like a possibility for that to be a tool?
Yeah, I think it's definitely something we can all think about. I think I generally refer to it as community science. Somebody's told me that we're shifting language around there, but citizen science, community science, I think it does have a place. I think I am aware that in some regions of our province, that used to be the case, that farmers actually would send in their samples to the ministry and it would be processed and they would get the results back. I'm not sure at what scale or scope, that sort of a thing. I think it's definitely feasible. I think especially when it comes to soil science, I think I'm just very aware of the importance of technique and methods and using the same methods so that we can compare the results across the base. I think it's not that there's a wrong way to do it. There might be, I'm sure there's a lot of soil scientists that are like, absolutely not. But if there is a wrong way if you're wanting to use it as representative quantitative data that you could rely on moving forward. But I don't think that it's off the table. We're seeing some great community science projects around pest monitoring happening. I know the University of Northern BC is just getting started of what would a pest monitoring network across Highway 16 look like? How could we educate producers so that they have the tools to be able to identify both beneficial and perhaps and not so beneficial pests and insects, be able to report back so that we can collect this baseline data to really be able to inform things moving forward. So I don't think it's off the table, but I think we need to make sure that we have the structures to support that data, the training to collect that information, and then the management of that data is also not insignificant. BCACARN does have a data sharing infrastructure. So we do have some structures where we could be uploading some data sets and allowing that to happen, but it would be a very coordinated effort. And I don't personally have experience with those projects, but I'd be very eager to hear from researchers or who do have that experience, perhaps Andy, but.
Awesome, thanks, Serena. Yeah, Andy, as Serena mentioned, do you have anything to add to that? Do you have any experience with this or any thoughts on what that might look like if that could be rolled out?
Not really. When you were talking, I was just thinking, one of the things I am conscious of is that there's loads of soil sampling going on. There's lots of people taking soil samples all over the place. And I think, if we can sort of coordinate that somewhere, that would be great. I have to confess, I was reading the questions when you were talking, Serena, so I didn't quite catch the last part of what you were saying. Do you want to repeat it?
Oh, just that I think I ended just by saying that I don't actually have any like direct experience managing like citizen science or community science projects and what the challenges are. I think for me, it's a phenomenal opportunity if we are provided the resources to provide the supports to manage it.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. That is true. Yeah.
Awesome.
Because one of the big challenges in any soil sampling is actually going to collect the soil. It's very expensive to do that. And if we can find a way that, farmers can do that themselves and send the soils, that helps a lot.
Yeah, I agree. Serena, were you going to add something?
Yeah, too many projects perhaps, but one exciting thing that I know that UNBC is working on is actually they're collaborating directly with 4-H BC on a soil test kit as a project for 4-H members. So it could be taking a step towards providing some of that training and discussion and knowledge around soil science to our new entrants at a young age could probably help build that capacity of this is how we collect. So this is how these are some methods to collect soil samples, and this is where you send them. So I think there are some unique things happening in BC that could potentially lead to some more of this data, but there's definitely a gap where for industry and researchers alike are searching for those solutions.
Cool, thanks to both of you. Yeah, I think there's some challenges with that with the citizen science approach, but also obviously some benefits. And I would say that from my own research, there's kind of that trade-off of the quality versus quantity. You can get this amazing quantity of data, but the quality can just be maybe not quite where you need it to be. And Andy, as Andy's pointed out, like collecting that high quality data is really expensive. And so I guess there maybe is a meet in the middle at some point in time. And the important piece to this that I want to point out for sure is in any of these conversations, if we're asking farmers to do this, unless there's a direct benefit to them of getting that data back, we do definitely try or aim to, as much as we can in our work, to be compensating farmers for whenever we're asking for them to do work for us in these trials. And there's some organizations that are doing on-farm work, especially in like plant breeding, and that compensation is happening, which is really great, just because it's never awesome to add another task to a farmer's list, unless either they're being compensated or there's some direct benefit to them. Okay, so moving on to let's see, question 7. And Serena, I think this question would be again for you. Is there any data being collected on water tables that you know of?
See, this is the the potential pitfall of talking about something that is not in your scope of knowledge. There is data, like we do have some data. I know we do have some watersheds that are mapped, and different information being available. I've had some recent conversations that really has provided me with a greater understanding and appreciation for the amount of work it does require to monitor water levels and that information. But there are some significant gaps. And it is probably a reflection of where I live that I'm really about the gaps, because living in perhaps a more rural component of BC, there's just a lot of baseline data we don't have. So when farmers who need to apply for water licenses, and they're required that you have to prove there's water in your enough water in your watershed to support your license, but your watershed isn't mapped. What's the solution there? That's just one small example of kind of the challenges that there are. So I think I've heard from a lot of producers is that this is absolutely an essential component, a resource that we have, and we do need to monitor it, but we don't even know where we've started from. So I think water tables have been mapped. There's some really new and exciting technology being looked at, like seismic waves, at trying to figure out how do we look and measure groundwater that way. I know, so there is a lot of work being done, but it is not within like my specific scope of practice. So I can really only talk in generalities and what I've heard from other people as it being there's some, not enough in general.
Yeah, and I think that ties into, as you both have been talking about, there's even, I mean, aside from the water table measurements, that the different universities have all of these soil sampling that they've been done, and that is, Serena, a big part of what ACARN is aiming to do is, even before we even get into that realm of citizen science, of just getting all the university data that's unpublished, and kind of gathering that, and then maybe some water table data will show up. I know in our lab we take that not as a primary measurement, but as kind of like an auxiliary measurement, and so I think that some of the labs will have some of that data. And so Andy, we're going to skip on this question for you, but I do have our next question is for you. So question 8 says, wow, that's an inspiring map to see the soil carbon increase. So that was Andy in your presentation. Any thoughts on why these practices aren't being adapted or adopted along the east?
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. That was the question I was reading when Serena was talking earlier. Okay. Thinking, wow, what's the answer to that? And honestly, I don't know exactly why that is, but I could guess that some of it is probably just down to the systems are very different over there. And in particular, my mind went to things like, growing potatoes, for example. Growing potatoes is quite, you can't do that without actually causing quite a lot of soil disturbance. And so that may be one of the things. And there is a lot of potato growing on the East Coast, and also probably permanent pasture as well. So they're not kind of these serial systems. And so there isn't an opportunity to adopt this kind of no-till system. So that's my guess, but I have to confess I'm guessing. That is the reason.
I can
yes, Serena, please
jump in. I was privileged to be able to attend the Canadian Forage and Grassland Association the last time they met in person in Moncton. So was able to hear from the scientists on the East Coast, and I can rest assured say that the forage and grassland systems in the East Coast are adapting these. They're heavily researched and working on these components, but as Andy kind of alluded to, it might just be that the scope of they are on the landscape, the percentages along those ends, but it's not that they're ignoring it.
No, not quite.
No, by any means. It might just be a reflection of and the type of data that one specific map was looking at. I've seen a lot of maps looking at soil carbon that, like, so bringing it back to BC, a lot of the land being used for agriculture in the central and northern interior wouldn't show up on maps because they're classified as natural lands or they wouldn't fall under those descriptions. Yeah. So there might just be some nuances that we're missing there.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense to me, that it's kind of this like interaction of different effects, and that it's not that those growers aren't trying to do the best. There's probably other things going on as well. So that is all the time that we have for our Q&A today. Before I wrap up and discuss a bit going forward in this series of different opportunities, Andy and Serena, do you have any kind of like parting thoughts or like final remarks that you'd like to share with us? And Andy, I guess starting with you, and then Serena.
Yeah, I think, you know what, I think, you know, the pressure of climate change and the effects of it are really, you know, that is really, I feel like it's really intensifying now, and there is a real move and enthusiasm or drive to do something about it. I do think that, you know, in the past there's almost been a kind of paralysis about it's such a huge topic, and then, you know, just trying how you tackle that. But I think, you know, increasingly we're seeing some really practical ways to deal with that. I think are really encouraging, and I'm kind of optimistic about the future. And I think, you know, agriculture will play a big part in you know, tackling this sort of global issue. But it isn't, and I think we do need to have a word of caution that, you know, agriculture alone, you know, as you've shown, isn't a huge producer. There are others out there, and, you know, it's going to be a combined effort. And I think a lot of that has to come from government and has to drive that policy really. So, you know, agriculture plays a part, but, you know, soils can only do so much, and there needs to be some bigger overarching policies there, particularly around transport. I think they need to be addressed. So, but overall, I'm optimistic and excited to see, you know, how science tackles it in innovation.
Awesome. Thank you, Andy. That's a great note to be ending on. And Serena, final remarks for our attendees today.
Yeah, I'd like just to thank everybody for taking their time on a Thursday to join our webinar and have this. These are important discussions to be having, and with BCACARN, we really are trying to increase collaboration, to get researchers talking to each other, to industry, to producers. We can't underestimate the need for encouraging new people joining our industry, people like yourself, Amy. So like training the next generation of researchers, training the next generation of professionals, of policymakers who really can understand the complexities of these challenges, that aren't making decisions in Victoria for the entire province that will actually only hinder adaptation approaches. Really making sure that we're opening up these conversations, I think, is absolutely essential in moving forward in climate change. And as Andy really articulated quite well, there are opportunities for us to mitigate. There's opportunities for us to lower our emissions, and I think producers are very keen to hearing and adapting those approaches. We need to, but at the end of the day, we do need to eat. And so working together to collectively find those solutions, acknowledge the challenges, but really collectively try to figure out how to move forward, and fairly quickly. It is urgent. I think that would probably be my final thought is, I can't tell It's pretty heartbreaking talking to farm producers and hearing about some of the devastation of their losses this summer. It's really top of mind for me, which probably was evident in my presentation. But instead of just pointing fingers at them as being a problem, yeah, just really entering in those conversations open-minded and looking for those additional perspectives of how we can move forward collectively.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Serena. I think that those are all great points of really understanding the nuances of how complex this is, coming up with reasonable solutions that will actually have impact. But as Andy's saying, like not being petrified by how big our problem is, and maybe just choosing some of those like low-hanging fruit opportunities to kind of hit the ground running and learn as we go. So yeah, I think that those are some awesome thoughts to be ending today on. Thank you. So I'm going to end with a bit of housekeeping. Going back, so I know that there is also some unanswered questions from today. So thanks to all the attendees for sharing your time with us. Thanks for submitting those questions. And keep your eye out for a follow-up email where I think we're hopefully going to try to address some of those unanswered questions and share some resources from today. And of course, a huge thank you to both Serena and Andy for being here with us today. Those presentations were great, and you also handled all of the questions on the spot really well as well. And I know that on behalf of all the attendees, we really appreciate your time and your knowledge being shared today. So behind the scenes, we'd also like to thank Melanie Kuksdorf, Mairead Norton, and Jacqueline Chan. And to all the attendees, you can join us in 2 weeks from now for our episode titled Innovation on the Farm. So that's on August 19th at the same time. It'll be 11 to 12:30. And then finally, to wrap up, you can also let us know what you thought about today's webinar. So you'll be directed to a short survey about this session after the webinar, and your feedback is much appreciated if you can take that time. And also feel free to visit our website at ubcfarm.ubc.ca. So yeah, finally, thank you for joining in, and we look forward to continuing the discussion in ongoing avenues. Thanks.